Good morning. Good morning. Okay. Can you hear me in the back, Ethan? You got it? All right. All right. As Mary has said, my name is Valencia Abbott. I am the history teacher here at the early college, and my wonderful students are sitting in the back row. Yay! Our students, yeah! All right. Um, Remembering Freetown is the topic, and just like Mary, I was unaware of this history until about 3 years ago. I grew up in Ruffin, that big city of Ruffin. And if you don't know, Rockingham County is actually one of the biggest counties in North Carolina, and it's a large area. So growing up in Ruffin, I did not have much interaction with Madison, even going to Greensboro. So growing up, going to Madison or Greensboro was a really big deal. In Ruffin, you went to Danville, okay? You went to Caswell County. You rarely came to this side of the county. So a lot of this history was new to me, and now it has become a fascinating adventure with Fletcher Dalton, and each year it has increased. Not only with Fletcher, but with our local historian Bob Carter, who brings another aspect. And then, as of last year, Travis Phelps, who brought another piece to this. And when I initially started this, I had told Fletcher, you need to find someone in Madison to help you with this, so it can be more personalized. And 3 years later, I'm still here, so I think it has become more personalized for me as well. What I'm going to do is that I am going to give you some background information about Freetown, and then the majority of the program is going to be with the people who actually live and work in this history. Um, we will have Fletcher Dalton, who's directly in front of me, Bob Carter, and Travis Phelps that will be conducting the most of the program. All right. Mary, this to flip. Okay. All right. Again, this is just going to introduce the people, Fletcher and Bob. Travis, I don't have a picture of you. All right. All right. Um, I want to start with the history of black towns, but before we start with the history, we have to understand that this history is steeped in slavery. And when we start talking about this time period, it makes a lot of people nervous, all right? But the truth is that we tell the truth in history. And in order to get the black towns, it starts with the antebellum period. It starts with slavery. Slavery does not end until 1865, all right? No matter what, you've heard about the Emancipation Proclamation, which my students already know, did not free the enslaved people, all right? But it ends in 1865 at the end of the war. During the time before the end of the war, you would have slave quarters, and slave quarters were the places that were on the outskirts of plantations. And make sure I get the names right. There were three identified plantations in Rockingham County. And Bob, you can help me with this. And anyone else, if my students already know, please feel free to interrupt, ask questions. I don't lecture. I like having conversations. So you will not it will not disturb me. It will not be a bother. Actually, I will appreciate it. But Bob, you can correct me on this. Do you think it was more than three plantations? Okay, but when I looked for the information, I only found three that was documented. And the three that I found was the Willow Oaks Farm, the Cascade Plantation, which was in Eaton, the Deep Springs Plantation, which is in Stoneville, and the Lower Sourtown Plantation, which was in Eaton. So those are the three of the largest plantations. Okay, but most people, and especially in North Carolina, did not own large numbers of people. Most people would have owned 1 to 2 humans, and they would have worked right alongside their owners, all right, and especially in North Carolina. You don't have the large plantations such as in Virginia and South Carolina, in North Carolina, all right. No, and the only one that I think was even close to 1,000 was in Durham, Stagville, and I think there were about 900. The last time I checked, they had about 900. All right. So, how black towns would have formed? Usually, they would have formed out of these slave quarters. So they would have been already established communities. The other way that they would be known as free towns or black communities that would have formed was after Civil War, when you would have had land that people felt was undesirable. You would have black people to move to that, or there would have been blacks that would have followed the Union military, and then they would have been stationed in those locations. So those are usually the three main ways that you would have had black communities to develop. And as far as Freetown, I'm not actually sure which way. I am thinking it probably came out of the slave quarters in the black community that was established before the Civil War. That's my assessment of where it would. But we don't have documented proof as of yet. We're still working on it. So after the Civil War, okay, we have the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment will abolish slavery, right? The 14th Amendment is called the Due Process or Citizenship Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote, all right? Because of these amendments doesn't mean that you got equality. All right, you will still have a system of segregation that will continue for over 100 years. And within that, you would have these populations of black communities that would actually thrive. Such as the one in Durham, Black Wall Street, the one in Wilmington, also were these black townships that was part of North Carolina history. So one of the things now is that the history of the Freetown, which again I did not know until Fletcher Dalton invited me to be part of his historical journey, is a story of a black community in Rockingham County that's going to come out of this history, that's coming out of this history of slavery, that is thriving. And Fletcher is going to share with us the history and his perspective on Freetown.
How many of you are from Madison? How many of you from Mayodan, for instance? Would you raise your hand if you're from Madison? Okay. We have some guests from Greensboro also. The thing about Valencia saying she doesn't lecture, she likes conversations. I do too. And I want you to know that students like to learn. So there's, in addition to what you hear today about Freetown, which is in Madison, I want the students perhaps to consider Possum Town, which is a Mayodan address, and which is the same almost to the white community as Madison is to the black community. But we won't go into Possum Town today. Madison had developed an area, I guess we should call it, along 220 north, which was populated by black merchants, black teachers, black preachers, black librarians, and so forth. A very nice little community, which my family helped participate. The first black library in Madison was in my grandmother's house, and she dispensed books. Students would come there to read. Yes. And there were libraries and churches also. So I think it's very good idea to study that, because I think that some of the blacks were from the Galloway plantation, which was in Madison also. So when our parents, my parents, and other parents decided to move toward Mayodan, one of the most exciting developments was called Straight Street. You've seen a sign on the post that says Straight Street. It was a very colorful community, all mill houses, that's small houses, 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, no indoor plumbing. But there was also a church there called Mount Carmel, which provided community unity, especially around Mother's Day every year, where you would have strong preaching in the churches and strong food on the outside. And you could have your choice. You could either go in and participate in the joyous ceremony outside, or you could go to vendors on the outside, some of who were selling products that were probably not agreed to by the church community. But, and we had very strict teachers because they knew the value of education. And one of the things that was very interesting was the state would not pay for teachers, black teachers, to get advanced degrees. So people like my mother and others would go to New York, to Columbia University or New York University, and get their degrees. And when they came back, the state had to pay them more because they had degrees than their white colleagues or compatriots who were paid very little. But that was an instance of segregation working for the black community rather than against the black community. So I would have you read from Russell Spear's book. He was the editor of the Madison Messenger. Some of the many articles written by Bob Carter here, or many articles written by Charles Roddenberrow, who now lives in Greensboro. But he wrote a lot about Madison and about what he called eccentric figures. Those eccentric figures made Madison very popular in Rockingham County. At one time, there were 16 hotels in Madison, and you wouldn't think right now that there would be that many people in Madison. But because of the tobacco trade and the cars coming through, there were many occupations practiced by the black community, such as mule-driven carts, or they would find some kind of inspiration. My neighbor, and it was a conservative community because my neighbor used to do washing, take in washing. She washed in these big, huge pots, cauldrons, the kind of pots you see people being boiled in, in comic books and so forth. But her husband bought her a washing machine, which she was too conservative to use. And so when he would go to work, she would take in washing and do it in that huge pot those few hours that he was away from home. Also, I found it fascinating that in an era where there was no refrigeration, they kept chickens, and she would always put the eggs under the couch so they wouldn't spoil. Very interesting to me. And another lady would go down to the stream and put butter in it, packaged butter, so it would keep cool. So you can always find ways to do things if you want to do things. But anyway, I found it very interesting that people even who live in Madison didn't know about Freetown. But it wasn't incorporated. It was just called Freetown because former slaves and their descendants were in Freetown. So I'm going to let you hear some interesting stuff about the graveyard, the black graveyard we found. And Mr. Phelps will talk about that.
All right, I'm Travis. If you see the picture that's up here now, the school is kind of where it started first for us. When I say us, my son has a group of youth in the community we called Your Community United Juniors. He would be here today, but he's actually in class taking a test at RCC. But it started off with the school. We noticed that the school was kind of run down, and they were looking to raise money to get it back up to par. We found out about Fletcher, Dalton, and the Freetown meeting, and my son and I, we spoke about, this could be a good foothold of where to start and what to, that we got to work with. We come to the meeting, but we had been asked by the town manager to look at a cemetery. Kevin Bond took me out there, and lo and behold, the grass was up to your waist. We did not know. It's located behind Fuzzy's. I don't know if you've got any of those, do you? It's located behind Fuzzy's. If you go down Nickel Street, it turns into a gravel driveway and it goes down, circles around. At that point in time, we had no clue how many were there. We started off on that Friday. The chief of police and captain and all come out, a couple of local merchants. What we were doing was flagging each grave. And weed eating around each headstone that we could find. The reason being is it was so deep. If you drive through with a lawnmower, you're going to run something over if you don't clear it out. So we started going through. Yep, that's some.
I think there's 3 of them from the altar. Yeah.
But the youth group came out that day, and they were prepared. They hand scrubbed 225 headstones by hand. They had no running water, so they had to use the little pump jugs and then spray the headstone off to clean it all off. But of course, youth being youth, asking the questions and the right questions. How many people out here, Travis? I don't know. Honestly, at that point, we had no clue. But once we started getting into it and counting them up and marking everyone's name, we found 225. Well, then they started asking, well, who were these people? Where did they live? Questions I still couldn't ask. But as mother and fathers of the older folks in town, in here, we know that if our child asks us something, we try very hard to find that answer. And we did. We started researching. From Fletcher Dalton's meeting and being around Bob, we knew that documentation was brought over here to RCC. So if you young folks are looking for a good education, start right back there in your historical department in the back corner right there. They have some, 9 boxes, if I'm correct, if that's what it was. There's much more. That's what we've gone through so far was the Franklin collection. We learned more in just a few days, just out of those few boxes, than we learned in months. We found names to look up. Rockingham wasn't the best record keepers. But the thing was, how will I know to ask for your name if I never knew the name to ask for in the first place? But once we started going through, and I'll show you what I'm talking about, back in the older days, the families would document in Bibles. They would write down births, deaths, weddings, you name it. You might even be able to ask some of your grandparents, and I'm sure they've done the same thing. But there's several of them in here, and I have no clue. You know how old these things are, Bob? I'd say they early 1800s, easy, wouldn't it? But it's quite a few of them in there. But it gave us information to go to Wentworth and look and see what they had to see maybe where the person lived, how old they were when they died. Wentworth didn't have it, so we have been going down to the state archives, and we are finding that information. We are now up to 325 souls in this cemetery. 32 veterans ranging from Civil War and up. We are 325 that we know of right now. We're still researching. We're not going to quit. But
Yeah, so when this article, which was last year, they were at 257.
Yep.
Right. The majority of these cemeteries will not have names, okay, or first and last names. They are most of them are going to be hand carved. Is that correct?
a lot of them are hand carved. There are some new up-to-date ones, as you can see, like in the front row here. But as you work further back to the back line of the trees, that's when they start getting. I wished I had Mr. Scales.
The one behind
The one that looks like a big log.
at the cemetery, or the one behind the?
It's down in the woods.
Oh no, I
I don't-
want the picture of the. Yes,
Yeah.
that's the one that I.
That's the one all about floors.
Yeah. I have that one.
The Reverend Faust. That's the gentleman. He's in Citizen Cemetery, Reverend Faust. They have been burying over there for a while now, but they wouldn't really taking care of the property itself. They let the grass grow up to your waist. So when they bring the bush hog in, they just drop it down. And when they drop it down, they're chewing up the headstones, the metal plates they just completely destroy. That was a problem for us. Um,
But this is based on the history of this cemetery being black.
right, right, exactly.
So I think that's part of that conversation of why this is going to be neglected.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the neglect was there, but what we seen when we went out, we could see where the rectangle of the grave where it's kind of sank down a little bit, so we know there. You are the first to know outside the group. We are having a ground scanner come in, and we're going to find everyone that we can find. Now, will we know the exact person? No, that's going to be hard because they date back so far. Some family members don't even live here anymore. It's like one little boy I was telling Fletcher this morning. He came from New York down here to visit his family, and he drowned in the river. Well, New York's what, 10, 11 hours away? How many family members do you think drove down here for his burial? Maybe some, but are they even still alive to know exactly where he was buried, being they only showed up for the one day? We're going to have a little trouble with that, but we're not going to stop. But what we want to originally do is the goal is to mark as many of the community members we can. Can we buy the $10,000 headstone? No. But we can get something that at least shows your name, your birth date if we know it, and the date that passed away. And then it'd be a permanent marker instead of those little cheesy aluminum plates they put out. Because when you do mow, like I said, it just shreds them like confetti. But we are in the process, and tomorrow at 10 o'clock, we're going to start scanning and getting the map out. We do have a gentleman that works for a funeral company, and he works mainly with the graveyard, so he will be drawing the map up for us. So we will have a proper, legit map. And then we'll just have to go back. And what we're going to run into is, I'll ask Mr. Fletcher, do you know where your mom and dad's buried? Well, he can point them out to us. And then maybe there's a cousin or a niece, and that's the way we're going to have to fill the blanks in. That's about the only way I know of, and it's going to be some work. But I'm grateful to be part of this. This is a project we're planning on keeping. There is a state law that states that the county has to take it over. That's some different issues there. But by law, they have to take it over and start maintaining it, and that's what we want. There's no use for neglect this date and time. So if y'all got any questions, I'll answer anything you got. And yes, ma'am.
There's some stones that didn't have any carvings at all, like just rocks.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. They'll have foot and headstones. It's just a rock, and that is a different rock. What I've been told is they're actually out of the river. So the river rock and field rock's two different. Am I correct on that? That's what I've been told? Yeah. Well, that's what I've been told. So, yeah. But they didn't actually have carved stones. Now, you have some of them that we've seen that they've kind of tried to scratch initials into them and stuff. But
This is behind,
all about floors.
these are the graves, those two graves behind it. The scales grave behind all about floors.
Yeah. And do you know about the stone that Mayadan has? Mayadan, yes, it's one of them. It's the mother. They've had it in their, I guess, lockup room. Yeah, the police department lockup room for 30-some years or more. And when we were working on Freetown, they reached out to Wendy, which is one of the members that's helping us do all the research and everything, to see if she could find out where it goes. And it actually goes to father and son here. Father, son, and mom were all buried all about floors, and they're buried there. I'm going to see if Eddie will go over there and scan for us on that one, too. That way we can, because you don't know. So we're going to have him try to scan that one for us, too. So one project has led to another and another and another. So,
Especially if you're not from Madison, because I didn't know. So, Bob, would you start us off with all about floors in the graves behind there?
I believe that. Okay. Thank you. I believe the man's name was Hardin Scales. Does that sound right? Anyway, these people evidently owned their own property there. And of course, there was no law saying you couldn't bury on your own property. So it happened. And Fletcher has told me about a Mosley family that's buried. Of course, the graves were later removed so a store could be put there. But there wasn't any law to stop that. And so there may be other cemeteries where this on a lot that the people own. There may be 2 or 3 graves. I'm not aware other than those 2, but there may be others. I enjoyed Fletcher's comments very well. He told a couple of stories I didn't know. So I've been doing this all my life. And, you know, you can still learn things if you talk to somebody that knows something you don't know. So that's good. I'm glad to be part of this because I'm interested in all Rockingham County history, and really all my life I've been interested. And we were talking about, they mentioned segregated cemeteries. One of the best examples of that, at the Wentworth Preservation Group, we've just marked and put up a kiosk up at the County Home Cemetery. Now, if you go to and read the kiosk, you'll see the whole history of the county home. And look at the cemetery behind the kiosk. It's segregated. The blacks are buried over next to 65, and the whites on the opposite side. And it's a little different. At the county home, there was a time from about 1927 through 1942 that the prisoners in the nearby state prison made small concrete markers, and they just put the name and the person's date they died. So anyway, Innocton Cemetery, and we have people come in very often looking, trying to find out more about their relatives that are buried there. Unfortunately, when the county home was closed in 1955, the records were destroyed, evidently. So we found some through, and I know Travis can answer this. Are you finding the information from the death certificates? Is that what? Okay. Right. Well, when we first started the project up at the county home about 25 years ago, a friend of mine went to the courthouse. At that time, the original records were there before they were transferred down to state archives. And he picked out every one that said somebody was buried in the county home. So we picked up a lot of names. But we still only know 2, maybe 150 to 200 names of people buried there. And there's more people. And also, I'll make a comment about the rocks. Cemeteries are all over the county, hundreds of them. Many of them have been destroyed, not necessarily because they were black, but sometimes farmers just pull the stones up. If nobody knows who it is, they'll say it's an Indian cemetery and destroy the cemetery. Well, of course, it wasn't. Indians didn't use tombstones, so that was not correct. But it's unbelievable how many cemeteries there are. And the DAR in Madison published books that Travis and others are aware of. And they worked on that project for, 20-something years and published about 12 books. And that was the first recording of the graves around the county. Well, that's been an ongoing project for several years. One of the main problems is the state of North Carolina did not require birth and death records till 1913. And you know, I can't help feeling, and I've worked with these for many years, that a lot of, in the black community, there were midwives. Well, the law said the birth certificate needed to be recorded, but I doubt that nearly all were recorded. And as Valencia was saying, that's part of the problem. But anyway, getting back to Freetown, Freetown was part of a slavery plantation. And the family that owned it was a Presbyterian minister, Reverend William Nelson Mebane. He bought a farm over off a river road in 1840 when he married evidently. And by the 1850s, he has moved to the land at Freetown. Of course, there's no Freetown there. He buys hundreds of acres of land. He owns about 19 slaves. Now, all that property has been, when they built a shopping center out there, what was called the Schaefer House was his home. He died in 1859, and so everything was erased down 30 foot deep to level the land, so there's nothing that could be found there now. But anyway, the land stayed in that family. His heirs continued to own the land, and he had a son, William Nelson Mebane Jr., who was a prominent lawyer. Well, he died in 1895. He had lived in Wentworth and practiced law with Mr. Hugh Scott. After he died, there needed to be, the Mebane still owned part of his father's property, so they needed a settlement. So they went to court, and his son-in-law, I guess it was, W.F. Carter, who was a lawyer from Mount Airy, North Carolina, filed a special petition against the heirs. That's the way you had to make settlements, to divide the land up and divide the money up and, complete the process. So anyway, in 1896, they put the land up for sale, which hadn't already been sold. Now, some of it had been sold. And this is where it gets mixed up. There was a story once told, a fellow said that Galloway gave the slaves land. Well, the Galloways didn't own it till much later, towards the 20th century, so that's certainly not true. And if you go look at the deeds, you will soon realize that's the way it is. It's Mebane land. All of Freetown was Mebane land. And when that settlement came in 1896, they put up lots, 100 lots. And I cut all my stuff down here and put it in a book. And they advertised it in the newspaper. And it appeared in the Greensville newspaper, Webster's Weekly, 27 February, 1896. And it says, public auction on the 5th of May, 1896, to begin at 10 o'clock. Beautiful building lots overlooking the railroad, the Mayo River, and the Mayo Mountain. Choice lots go all the way up close to the textile mill, which had just been built the year before in Madison. The land is good to make brick. It was the land of the late Judge W.N. Mebane. Terms of the sale will be announced. W.F. Carter, administrator. He was appointed executor to not executor, but commissioner to sell this property and make settlement among the Mebane areas. And he lived in Mount Airy. Okay, there was a plot, a land plat, but nobody can find that. And W.B. Trogdon, a surveyor from Eden, made this plat of all the lots in Freetown that they were going to sell. And it says, the first sale says 50 lots on both sides of the street. And it says below there, Madison is a new town on the Norfolk and Western Railroad, 30 miles from Winston-Salem, and so on. And it says, residences wanted, business house wanted, good tenants, and so on. But there's a total of 100 lots to be sold. And, okay.
These lots were sold strictly to black people?
No. They were sold. And, okay, I've got some of the paperwork about that is in, okay, here it is. Clerk of order, the clerk's Superior Court order Okay, Mr. Mebane filed this in the William Mebane estate and is the widow and so on. Let's see. Okay, it lists each lot. It doesn't say exactly how large a lot is, but the first lot in Section 6 was purchased by J.M. Vaughn for $35. Now, as you go down this there's 30-some lots in this thing, and I recognize most of these names, and every one of them are white people, and which is strange. I can't figure out part of that. I think they're well-known names, Pratt Brothers, McAnally's, so on and so on. And the lots bring $27, $51, $44.
So we would make the assumption that they were bought and then the land was either rented or sold to black.
Yes, absolutely.
Have the records of,
Well, there's deeds. There's deeds for all.
have the deeds of them being sold.
Well, they could be found, but you're talking that many deeds. When you go look at the indexes and see how many there are, it's a big job to do that. And
Let me make sure. So this Mebane land was broken down after he died.
In lots.
Into smaller lots, and they were
Right.
bought by white
people,
white
which,
and then those lots were sold, which we're thinking either sold or the land was rented to black people.
well, I think the lots were sold to them. And this can be confirmed, but it's, you would be surprised how many deeds there are. If you go to the courthouse and look at the indexes, it's a big job. And here's another lot going on through. And I recognize most of these names after doing research for over 50 years. They're people in Madison and farmers that are around are buying these lots. And I guess they realize they can make money by holding them a short time and selling those lots. No, none of these people lived in Freetown. But I think they just did it on speculation and then resold it. And then that's when the houses are built and the people settle on it. Well, of course, originally black people didn't work at the mill. But you see, this is it's from mill property, which all the way, and including, but there's numbers of maps and things that show it's Mebane property till it's sold, cut up and sold.
But with the opening of the mills, didn't those companies come in and buy up the property around the mills?
They did.
For their workers? So we can't necessarily say that it was all set for black.
Well, actually, they didn't buy it for their workers. They built houses. The mill company built houses and rented it to them. And some of these people are probably there, but when you extend on farther back to what's Freetown now, I think the same thing happened there. I found another land sale in 1901, and a businessman in Madison buys up, 8 or 10 lots. And it says being from the Mebane home place. So, that's said over time in every one of these deeds. So there's a lot more research could be done on that. One thing that was in Raleigh that's a little different, in 1972, there's a family named, it was LeSueur originally, then it's LeSueur. Anyway, that name, in 1972, a man named Anderson LeSueur in Washington, D.C., writes to the clerk of court in Rockingham County wanting to know about the special proceeding that led to the sale. And what he's wanting is the plat map. And Irene Pruitt, who is clerk of court, says there's no plat map recorded in the courthouse. Well, a friend of ours, Lisa Withers, looked at the record, what been sent to Raleigh since that time, and there's no plat map in there. So I guess somebody kept the plat map, and I assume we will never see the total outline of how Freetown was laid out. But of course, if you look at the maps today, a lot of the lots are the same size as they were. And one other point, going through, I've read old newspapers years and years and years. The first mention of Freetown that I've ever found so far, and I assume there's other mentions, I just hadn't found them yet, is 1903. There's a small train wreck up there in Madison, and the man in the newspaper says something about some of the people from Freetown came up to see the train. So that's the first recorded, but I'm sure the name existed earlier. But that's just the first time I'd ever found it. So if there's other, and I bought some of the deeds here, but I don't want to bore you with a whole bunch of deeds. I did look up a number of things about it, and but it's just the same thing. And let me speak about the Galloway a minute. John M. Galloway did buy the Schaefer home place of 151 acres, and that is Mabin land. But he didn't buy this till about 1900, so he does not own the land. All that land is Mabin land back to slavery times and so on. So, but he buys it because he's buying land everywhere, and he bought a few of the lots too. But the legend that we've heard and somebody made up about him giving this former slaves land just simply is not true. The deeds prove that is not true. So, I'm like Valencia. We got to get this history correct. And it's still interesting history, but, we want to be correct about it. Now, if there's any questions, I probably haven't covered everything I should, but yes. I don't think, no. No, it was farmed. No, I don't think it's because of the mill. I think there's a whole lot of lots here. And some of those lots next to Madison may have been so, well, of course, the mill, as we pointed out, mill rented the houses that they built. But, you had all this section that's now Freetown is I see it as a separate section that's later established.
My assumption or my thinking is that before the Civil War, that would have been where you would have had blacks that would have located, whether they were on the plantation or whether they settled there.
Well,
Kind of an establishment. In other words, they were congregated there for some reason,
because Reverend Mabin owned 19 slaves. He owned 19 slaves, and they certainly lived on that tract of land.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and they would have been separated.
So that kind of was the genesis of it, or the beginning.
Again, don't have proof, but based on how other free towns would have been established, that would be my assumption.
Is anybody else?
Right, yeah, right. They could have been.
They had businesses downtown, and then all of a sudden they have businesses in Freetown.
Right,
So it's kind of a push.
right. That could have been the case as well.
Yeah, of course, there was a lot of businesses out in Madison, but didn't most of that property burn at some time where they had the businesses in Madison? Of course, Madison included Freetown, but it wasn't a separate place. It was, as you say, just a name that was given to it. You didn't.
And I think maybe part of that will go back to where the churches were established. And
Yeah.
This is St. Stephen's, and it was.
Well, St. Stephen's deed is 1925, I think.
Yeah, but this says St. Methodist Episcopal established in 1890.
Well, it was probably a different location. They built a new church there. Yeah.
Right, but they were at that location, so the genesis or the beginning of what there was some reason that they were there, whether by choice or force.
Yeah, look, there's more black settled here. Y'all go up, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think, again, based on what I've seen so far, that there were blacks there, and that this Freetown is going to rise from that.
Okay, was there any other questions? Well, I guess that winds me down, so. Okay. Here you go.
So we have a few minutes left, and I actually want to end this with Fletcher and talk about black community, all right? Because when we talk about slavery and the horrendous history that have, the black community that was built up offers so much support. And it was one of the reasons that we got Fletcher, that to have this background, you go to Fisk, right? Right. That we build this society that creates this people or these generations that's going to excel. So yes, the horrors of history, but out of this community of blacks, you have this attitude that we are going to not only own our history, but we are going to become better people for it. So the fact that the blacks were together, whether they were put there by force or whether they was put by there for choice, they had strength in numbers. So I want Fletcher to end this with just giving us some highlights of growing up in that black community. They know you have to sit. Yeah.
Thank you, Valencia. The fact is that education was always a part of the black history in Freetown. Could we show that sequence again?
Sure.
That is Charles Drew. That's the old school.
Right. I got a picture of the old one, and then when we went out that summer and the condition. That's over 2 years old, so I don't know if it looks like that now.
It looks worse.
It looks worse. Okay. Yeah. That's that. Yeah, that was 2 years old.
I just talked to the committee that was interested in restoring the old school, and they say there's no interest now. They tried to have a meeting, but no one came. So that building is likely to fall into disrepair pretty soon, because some of it is already in this disrepair. Yeah, it looks worse.
What were the grades that are within the school?
What ages were in there? I mean, like high school, grade school, everybody, or
High school.
This one,
That's Charles Drew. That was elementary.
that was elementary, and this was high school.
Well, they all grew. Charles Drew started with elementary, but I graduated from there.
From this one,
The brick one you just showed.
this
That one, yeah. Now it's gone too. That school has been incorporated into another school downtown.
It says it serves as elementary through high school until the 1950s,
Yeah.
and it was built in 1924.
Right. So the old school project has just about failed right now. And the committee to save it was only about 12 people, and hundreds and thousands had gone to that school. So it's a very difficult thing to see it fall apart. But this happens, you know, elsewhere. So the black community realized that education was very important, both religious education and secular education. And that's why there was a lot of pride in those schools. But you couldn't get a job even if you graduated from that. You had to go to Greensboro or Winston or maybe even Reedsville or Eden, you know. So it was very difficult.
People would have left the area.
Yeah, or never come back after they got the education, you know.
Because this would have been the time of the Great Migration. So after World War I, up until the 1970s, when you have blacks that are leaving the South, but definitely educated blacks.
So students today could check on the educational requirements that were there then, because it's very important to know how we progressed from books. The books that were given to the black community very often had pages torn out of them. The pencils were broken and so forth. That's from the budget for the year, you know. And they just had materials that were no good. But they fought anyway and, you know, got the education they really wanted and their parents wanted for them.
Yeah, and my students know this because I tell them all the time. Neither one of my parents graduated from high school, and I'm 55, and one of the things that was for my generation was that we were going to get a high school diploma. That was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And how education was a deep-seated need. I'm not even going to say an option, a deep-seated need in the black community. And that was going to be one of the things that was going to help this community to survive out of the history that it had. So this ability to have this community around you, because it just wasn't your parents. It was that whole community that was going to get you where you needed to go. With that.
I forgot to mention, I'm very glad to be here today because my father, in his 60s, got a degree from here.
All right. So we only have a couple of minutes, and I only have a couple of minutes before I have to go to my next class. But are there any questions, and you can do one-on-one after we dismiss if you want to. I have to leave at 12:15, but Bob and Fletcher and Travis can be around if you want to continue the conversation with them. All right.
Thank you, Valencia.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you for bringing me into this. All right. I hope you enjoyed the information. It is ongoing. Fletcher has already set the date for August, the third Saturday in August. I will be there because he's already told me I will be there. We will update any research that we have. We will be at the Madison Public Library around 1 o'clock on the third Saturday in August. And what we do, this will be our fourth year. We will just update any information. We have a Facebook page that I try to update as much as I can, and we share information because, as Bob has said, as I have said, we want to make sure that we get the history right. And it's just not talking about it. We have to have documentation. We have to have proof. So, Oh, yes. And Fletcher wanted me to tell you, if you have photos, we would like to have those as well. All right. Thank you very much.